Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Ralph Fiennes directs and co-stars in the true story of Rudolf Nureyev and his defection to the West in The White Crow. In 1961, celebrated Soviet ballet dancer Rudolf Nureyev, played by Oleg Gurvenko, is on tour with the Kirov Company in Paris, having trained under the watchful eye of Alexander Ivanovich Pushkin, played by Ralph Fiennes. Refusing to be bound by the restrictions placed by Soviet handlers, Nureyev mixes with the French locals, including Adele Exarchopoulos' Clara Saint, frustrating the KGB agents following him. As Nureyev becomes increasingly threatened for his behaviour, his only choice to escape is a defect. The White Crow is the third film directed by Ralph Fiennes, who previously handled the Shakespeare adaptation Coriolanus and the Charles Dickens biopic The Invisible Woman, and it's written by David Hare, an acclaimed playwright who previously worked with Fiennes before, having wrote the script for The Reader. He also did the screenplay for the Virginia Woolf movie The Hours. The film charts the early life of Rudolf Nureyev, perhaps the most celebrated dancer and choreographer of the 20th century, whose routines dazzled audiences all around the world, but he's perhaps most famously known for his very public, very high-profile defection from the Soviet Union in 1961 at the height of the Cold War in a Paris airport. It's that drew Fiennes to the project, understandably so because it's a very dramatic incident. Nureyev led a very remarkable life, coming from extremely humble beginnings, being born on a Trans-Siberian train and rising to the height of his profession. And in fact, there's actually a documentary about his life that coincides with the release of this film. They're both coming out at roughly around the same time. The film actually uses Julie Kavanagh's book about Nureyev as its inspiration, and you would think, given a subject that has led such an incredible life, you would think that would make for a fantastic film, and unfortunately, The White Crow makes a number of missteps. The fundamental problem with The White Crow is that it doesn't seem to know what it's trying to do with the story it's telling. Are we telling Nureyev's life as a biopic, or are we telling it as a defection tale? It can be either of those things, but when he tries to do both of them at the same time, it ends up being incredibly ill-disciplined and ill-focused, and this shows in the movie's structure, which is non-linear, and it does not need to be. This right here was my biggest problem with the film right out of the gate, because it much more hurts the film than it does serve it. So the main thrust of the film, as you would probably suspect, is Nureyev in Paris, but whilst this is going on, we're cross-cutting to two different flashback narratives. We're getting Nureyev's birth and early childhood inexplicably presented in 2:35 black and white, and then we're getting Nureyev's early training with Pushkin, played by Ralph Fiennes. And there's no clear delineation a lot of the time, particularly for the later training flashbacks. At least with the childhood ones, you know exactly where you are in the story. This has a strangely disorientating effect because there's no obvious rhyme or reason to the film's structure, and I just found that frustrating as an audience member, and I couldn't understand for the life of me why they decided to do this, because this is already a movie with a fairly niche appeal, so you don't need to alienate the audience even further by doing things this way. There will be people going to see this movie who may not have heard of the man that it's based on, and if you're trying to inform people about his story, why would you tell it in the most confusing, convoluted form like this? It does not work at all. And as I sat there watching it, I was thinking with my Airsing head on, going, well, why wouldn't you just tell this story straight? So much of this movie's problems could have been at least partially remedied by just telling it in the right order. This is supposed to be a story that builds towards a big climatic event, so the structure needs to be propulsive, it needs to build a head of steam, but every time it cuts back and forth through time, it ruins the movie's momentum. And at points, I was actually wondering, how is this even supposed to be accessible to an audience if you don't even know where you are? The way that I would have told this story may have been a little bit too mainstream and may have been a little bit too conventional, but at least it gives the audience some reason to care about what's going on. I would have told this as something resembling a thriller, as a man's struggle for his own independence and ultimately his own freedom, and you would have incorporated elements of, say, the espionage thriller. I mean, the guy is being followed by the KGB everywhere he goes. He knows that he's being surveilled, he knows he's being watched. He's got this anti-authority streak running all throughout him. There's easy things that you could do with this story to get the audience to care about what's happening on screen, and yet the movie is so obstinate. It feels like it's deliberately trying to hold the audience back. And the problems with Hare's script are exacerbated by Fiennes' direction, which seems dedicated to covering this story in the flattest manner he could possibly do so. And I think I understand what he's trying to do here. He's trying to visually represent repression on screen, in that the world of ballet, it's very mannered, it's very controlled, in the same way that living life in the Soviet Union is very rigid and very oppressive. I understand that, but at the same time, so much of this movie is either locked off, centered close-ups, or long takes with very little camera movement. And making things worse is the movie looks musty. It really genuinely does, especially with the colours that they've chosen that are so desaturated they border on grey at points. It's a movie that looks like cinematic beige. It's not an interesting film to look at, and so when I'm being pushed back as an audience member on a visual level, on a storytelling level, what am I supposed to be doing? The film feels so dry. In fact, I was actually bored at certain points in this movie, and how do you do that with a story like this, with a person like this? That seems almost criminal. Even when the movie's in Paris, you would think there would be some sort of difference to the visual energy on screen. Maybe the colours will be a bit more saturated, there'll be more cross-cutting and editing, and yet, no, it doesn't. The scenes in Paris feel just as lifeless as the ones in the Soviet Union, and so that doesn't work on that level. As far as his performance goes, I think Olgavenko does a really good job, considering this is his very first film role, and he has a number of scenes in a second language, which would have been formidable for anyone. So when I have issues with Nureyev's portrayal in this film, it's not to do with him, it's again to do with the writing. Now, I understand that Nureyev was a difficult person in real life. He was a notorious perfectionist with a fiery temper, and he could be quite obstinate. So if you're making a film about him, I can understand trying to be faithful to the spirit of the real life person that you're bringing to the screen. I can understand not buffing that out. At the same time, though, you do need to make him, if not likeable, at least compelling, someone that I want to watch on screen. There's a very fine difference between a character that's prickly and a character that's the same word with the last two letters off of it. And boy, does the White Crow keep falling into that trap. Now, Nureyev as a character in this film, he's very anti-authority. He's brushing up against Soviet officials who are telling, oh, you can't go to that dance school, you can't go on this tour, and so on and so forth. But it gets to the point where he is just unconscionably rude to people. He's terrible. There's a scene where he's talking to a Soviet official who's telling him, oh, you can't go to that dance school, and he spits on her desk. There's a scene where he's in a toy store because he's obsessed with toy trains because of the way that he was born, and he gets really angry at the store owner just because of the models that he's given of, no, this is rubbish, stop giving me rubbish. Worst of all is a scene where he's in a restaurant and he's with Clara Saint and he's appalling. He insults her to her face, acts incredibly badly. Bear in mind, this is the woman who will go on to have a key role in him managing to escape from the Soviet Union in a time of dire need, and it's just really awful. Like, why are we supposed to relate to this character on any level? It just gets to such an extreme that it's, again, another element of the movie that just feels off-putting. There's not enough there to correct those faults in character. And maybe we would have been a little bit more sympathetic had we seen a little bit more of Nureyev's artistic ability. The main reason that Ivanko was chosen for this role, in fact a major reason that a number of dancers appear in this film, is because there are very challenging routines. They're doing the same moves that he did. And there are really great dance sequences in this film where we're following his performances, but they're all too infrequent. That's a really strange thing about this movie, is that you would think that, given it's about a dancer, it would put that at the forefront, and yet there's only individual scatterings of it all throughout the movie, but never for very long. And that's a disappointment, especially because the characters keep going on about, oh, maybe he had an explosion of character, which seems odd because he seems like a very individualistic person to begin with. That's why he's called the White Crow. And Pushkin also says, oh, it wasn't about politics, it was about dance. Are you sure? Because the movie that I watched, it didn't really have anything to do with dance, and everything to do with the fact that he was in direct jeopardy. He was having to try and save his own skin. I don't think that dance was entirely on his mind when he made that decision, quite frankly. And if that was supposed to be the point of the film, then why wouldn't you foreground the dance element? Speaking of Pushkin, let's get into Ralph Fiennes' role in front of the camera, which I understand he was quite reluctant to do at first and only really agreed to because it would help bring funding for the film, which I totally understand. And to his credit, he gives himself a very unshowy supporting part. In fact, the most distinctive thing about it is that all of his dialogue is in Russian, which must have been incredibly formidable for him. And for my account, I have no idea what his Russian accent is like. I'm not a Russian speaker, but it sounded perfectly decent to me. And it certainly shows his commitment to the project, but also his determination to dial himself down, to blend in. This is by no measure a star performance, especially given that the character that he's playing is very quiet and exceptionally reserved to a fault. And Pushkin and his wife play a major subplot in the film. When Nureyev gets injured, he moves in with them and they're all sharing this one room together, and eventually Pushkin's sexually frustrated wife starts having an affair with Nureyev. And the initial seduction scene is very weird. Nureyev looks frankly perplexed as she's grabbing his crotch. It's a very peculiarly acted scene to begin a very odd subplot. I have no idea if this was actually based in reality or not. It doesn't seem like something that he would manufacture from whole cloth, but even so, it's a strange thing to put in this movie because it doesn't really come into play with much of anything. It seems like an attempt to me to try and give Ralph Fiennes a little bit more screen time. There are bookending scenes at the start and end of the film where Fiennes appears and he's being questioned by a KGB agent, which again seems like an attempt to just put Fiennes in the movie right up front because the backers demanded it. It's a storyline that you could cut completely out of the movie and it would make no effect on it whatsoever other than making it considerably shorter. It's a really odd thing to include in the movie. I don't know why it's there at all. It's just so unnecessary. And especially because at 130 minutes, this film's length really starts to drag, and cutting this subplot would have at least aided that. It probably wouldn't have helped with the film's enormous pacing issues, but at least it would have made the film shorter. And I think what makes it clear how much of this film is a missed opportunity is actually in the final sequence when he defects. That is by far the strongest section of the film. The whole sequence where they're at the airport is genuinely intense, because suddenly he doesn't know what's going to happen to him. You've got KGB agents telling him, you can't go to London, you have to go back to Moscow. Why? And they're telling him different reasons, and he knows that something's up. He doesn't know if he's going to die, he doesn't know if he's going to be locked away somewhere. It's a scary moment, and suddenly the film springs to life. Suddenly there's some kind of energy. It's because there's some jeopardy to what's going on. Suddenly I'm engaged in the action in a way that I wasn't for much of the preceding film, and that is by far its strongest section, and that's why I'm saying that this movie should have had more of a thriller element to it, or at least built some kind of suspense all throughout it. You're building up this antagonism between Nureyev and the KGB agents that are shadowing him, the people that are trying to control him, the people that are telling him you can't do this, and people are warning him, if you do this, we're going to have to take action, we're going to have to punish you in some way, and the consequences could be really severe. And so that is where the film really works for me, and if it was more like that and didn't focus upon weird things like Nureyev having an affair with Pushkin's wife, we might have been talking about a much better movie. The problem is that this is such a long film, and this is maybe the final 15 to 20 minutes of it, and it comes far too late. You cannot simply put the most interesting bit at the end of your movie and think that you've told the story satisfactorily. The White Crow seems almost determined to try and make its subject as uninteresting as possible. It has a non-linear structure that is discombobulating. The visual look of the film is unappetizing. The main character is written as boorish and selfish, and it's a dance movie that doesn't even have that much dance in it. So who is this supposed to be appealing to? Definitely not mainstream audiences, given this is largely in Russian and subtitled, although those factors sure aren't helping. And if you're a fan of Nureyev, I can't even recommend the movie on that front, because even though it's covering arguably the most fascinating portion of his life, you certainly wouldn't know it from watching the film, and you'd be better suited watching a documentary about him like the one that has just been released, especially if you're new to the subject, because I was new to Nureyev when I watched this movie, and I don't think I learned very much about him from seeing it. I certainly didn't get a sense of his importance or want to explore more about him, which is a huge failing for a biopic. This is clearly very well intentioned, but it is also a total bore. Despite being based on a fascinating true-life figure, The White Crow fails to take flight because it doesn't seem to know whether it wants to be a biopic of Rudolf Nureyev or a defection thriller, and fails at both. David Hayer's script is both confused and confusing, especially its unnecessary non-linear structure that is frustrating and ruins the film's momentum, and Ralph Fiennes' direction is far too repressed and mannered, resulting in a very flat and dry film that only really comes to life in its final moments covering the defection. Oleg Avenko does his best, but Nureyev is written as a hideously selfish character that is difficult to like, and the movie gives little sense of Nureyev's accomplishments to those who are unfamiliar with him, and surprisingly even has relatively few dance sequences, although those are the relative highlights. Fiennes also missteps with a puzzling infidelity subplot that adds little to the film, and the end result is a movie that takes a dramatic real-life event and smothers it of anything interesting. If you like this review, then you can dance over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, but until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.